Hello and welcome to today's webcast hosted by the Sales Management Association. Our session will start in just a couple of minutes. First, some very brief announcements. Please note that we will not open our attendees' audio or video lines during the session today, but we very much welcome your questions and comments. We encourage you to submit them. You can do that at any time during the session. And the way to do that is easier now. You simply click on the chat button that you'll see in the top right corner of the video display. That will ask you to create a little name and submit your question right on the screen there. If you don't want to do it that way, you can also email us and we'll remind you about how to do that. You'll notice a little scroll on the bottom of your screen right now that has our email address, support@salesmanagement.org. You can send your questions and comments there. We'll monitor that mailbox if you don't want to use the public chat. Also, as a reminder, please remember that our session will be recorded today. We'll make it available for playback in the Sales Management Association's resource library. Our members will be able to go there and view the archive and also download copies of today's slides. Our session today is one in a series of Sales Management Association online presentations that feature practitioners and thought leaders in the field of Salesforce effectiveness. If you're joining us for the first time, we'd like to welcome you. Appreciate you coming to our webinar today. We'd also encourage you while you're here to take a look around and consider membership in the Sales Management Association. You can do that on our homepage and see various membership options. We'd also like to encourage you to attend our Salesforce Effectiveness Conference. This is coming up December 7th and 8th. We hope you can join us in Atlanta at the Gozueta Business School at Emory University, who is graciously hosting this year's event. And you'll see a lot of great content there. I hope you can make that December 7th and 8th. I'm Bob Kelly, Sales Management Association Chairman. It's my pleasure today to talk to you about this, a very important topic, and also co-present with someone who's joined us for these sessions focused in sales coaching program effectiveness, and that is Bob Sanders. I'd like to introduce him now. Bob Sanders is a partner at Axiom Sales Kinetics, which is a provider of Salesforce effectiveness solutions and services. Bob recently returned to Axiom after serving as Chief Operating Officer at Reflect Systems, a digital signage software provider. He joined in 2018 as Executive VP of Sales. Under Bob's leadership, Reflect Systems' recurring revenue doubled and the firm was acquired. Bob is a frequent and highly rated presenter to Sales Management Association audiences. His areas of thought leadership include sales coaching effectiveness, management development, sales training, and sales process optimization. I'll just say on a personal note, I don't know of anyone more expert or credible with more standing in our community on this topic we're talking about today, sales coaching. So it's always great pleasure, and it's always really useful to have with us Bob Sanders. Adding him to the stage. Oh, he's tiny. Let's make him the same size.
No, that's perfect. Tiny was good. Nobody could see my neck when we were tiny.
Let us not discuss
we won't discuss my
neck of Bob Sanders. Let's instead talk about today's session. First of all, thank you for being here, Bob.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Once again, I'm going to remind our audience that this is a standalone session, but it will be later packaged as one in a series. We'll talk a little bit more about this series, but this is a series of sessions devoted to helping organizations be effective at coaching and in the coaching programs that they invest in. So I asked Bob if I could have the first 3 minutes or so of the session because I want to actually what I want to do is ask a question that people attending this session are not asking because they've already answered it. That question is, why should you invest in a sales coaching program? I want to ask the question anyway, because I think the way we answer this question helps us begin then to answer the chief question on the table today. How do we assess these programs and tell if they're effective? So let's investigate this question, if you'll indulge me for a moment. Why should we invest in sales coaching programs? After all, many of them fail. We know just under half are not effective. And obviously, they take a lot of time and energy. They absorb some sales capacity. They're expensive, in other words, and risky, given that more than half actually fail. So, given this, why would you want to invest in a sales coaching program? Let us count the ways. I think there are mainly three here. Okay, so first of all, overall, firms with effective sales coaching are more productive. They perform better than other firms. They are more likely to meet sales objectives. They are also more adaptable. They are better at implementing change. We think this is very important. And thirdly, they're better places to work. And so they are more competitive competing for talent. So this is my argument. Summarizing it thusly, three things. Firms that coach well are more productive, they are more adaptable, and they have an advantage in the labor market. And this, I think, is a very important thing for sales organizations right now. So I want to very briefly explore these three areas. So first of all, productivity advantages of firms that coach effectively. We know from our research that effective coaching correlates with better performance. The firms that coach effectively are 22% more likely to meet their firm sales goals. They have 17% higher growth rates. Overall, they are 9% more productive. Secondly, let's talk about change. I'll make the slide a little bigger. What we know is that sales organizations are confronting a lot of change. This slide, for example, shows the answers to a question we posed to management at 60 B2B sales organizations. How much change did you experience in the past 3 years? And how much change do you expect to experience in the next 3 years? So the answer to the first question was around 80% said they experienced a high degree of change. But the answer to the second question is 92% of firms expect to experience a high degree of change in the next 3 years. Here's the gag with this slide. We asked this question in Q4 of 2018, just before the global pandemic. So suffice it to say, these people were right. But more importantly, the people, and this is in a subsequent study that we did about a year and a half later, in the throes of COVID, we asked firms to tell us what were their prospects for meeting the sales objective, given that they were in the middle of COVID. And we found that the firms that were able to implement change effectively, they were more than 3 times as likely to meet their sales objective. In other words, being change capable as an sales organization correlates compellingly with overall success. So being able to change is important. Coaching, of course, helps us do that. And then lastly, coaching impacts the people in the sales organization. We know that coaching is a very important factor that impacts the retention of key salespeople. That is our highest performers. We ask, what are the important factors that contribute to retention? 84% of companies said it's really important to have a good culture. And just 1% less, 83% said it's very important to provide coaching and professional development to these high performers. Similarly, coaching and development ranks at the top or second to the top in these factors that impact new hire salesperson success. So, in short, coaching helps us attract and make new people successful, and it helps us retain key people. As companies struggle with these things in the labor market now, they have become important. So this brings us to an important question, which is, if this is, which I would summarize as follows: if these are worthy outcomes, that is, if these are appropriate outcomes for us to consider, maybe we should measure coaching's impact on these very outcomes. That is, the organization's productivity, its ability to adapt to and implement change, and thirdly, its ability to enhance the sales employee value proposition. So, with that in mind, I'll get Bob back on the screen. Maybe I should ask Bob, do you think this is a reasonable expectation? If these are the outcomes, should we begin with them in mind and work backwards from them?
Yeah, I think we absolutely should. And I think that it's interesting because the programs that don't produce those outcomes are the ones that are going to fail for sure, but they're not the only ones that fail. Sometimes they'll fail because they don't produce those outcomes. Sometimes they'll fail despite the fact that they are producing those outcomes because there isn't any clear way for people in the organization to see that. And so I think to really assess the programs effectively, it's absolutely essential that we understand how are results produced and what exactly do coaches do that impacts the results. How do they do it? They don't just do it by selling 4 reps, though some managers do that, but that's not coaching, right? How does that happen? But I absolutely think the starting point for evaluating the effectiveness of the programs is definitely these 3 areas.
Cool. Well, you're going to help us figure out how to do that. So I'm going to turn you loose in helping us answer that question, namely, how do we start to assess the coaching activity and mapping it to these outcomes?
Awesome. Let's fire away. I think I want to start by going through something we talked about before, and we do have on slide 5, Bob, there is a free gift for participants today. So if you go to slide 5, on the slide there's a QR code, and there is a book that we wrote and recently republished, and we're giving that away for free. The QR code will get you registered for that.
Well, I've messed up the slides, Bob, but I'm going to find that, and let me take these down. I'll find it and put it up momentarily.
And I can get started while you do that. The QR code will get you access to that. And what's interesting about that is the person who is featured in the story, it's written as a fable, the person who is featured in the story is an expert sales coach. And the fable traces through a new chief sales officer getting the job and having to figure out how to produce a result in an environment where it doesn't end up being as simple as just hiring the top producers from his previous team. So I think you'll enjoy it. No cost. If you want, this is for a Kindle version, but if you want a paperback version instead, there's no problem with that. When you register, when we send you a note back, just reply and let me know that you'd prefer paperback, and we'll get that for you. So that's actually the last slide. So there's something else. We're going to give you something else at the end, but you have to sit through the whole thing for that one.
Yeah.
So yeah. If we could get
I messed this up. Give me a minute.
Yep. No worries.
Why don't you proceed, and then
I'm going to dance a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah. While you do that, I'm going to dance a little bit. So I want to talk first about, in order to understand the connection between what managers do and how they interact with sellers and the outcomes that Bob's talking about, sales organization productivity, the adaptiveness of the sales team, and the sales employees' personal satisfaction with their work, it's important to understand how performance is actually produced. And we have a tool that Bob will put on the screen here in a minute for that, called the Sales Performance Pyramid. There it is. And it's actually a performance pyramid. It's not sales performance. It's any performance pyramid. And I want to walk through this. And if you've been on these sessions with us before, you've actually seen this. But here's the way this works. Results, outcomes, whether that's winning a game and scoring points, or it is winning a competition where you're a performing artist and you're being judged. Those outcomes are the results of the behaviors. And I want to put a caveat in here. Certain environmental scenarios can improve everybody's results. But when you are competing for limited opportunities, which is normally the case, now when there's a global pandemic followed by a serious problem with supply chain, a lot of times you don't have to be effective at selling or coaching. You're going to sell everything you have because there isn't enough available. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about those environments. I'm talking about a competitive environment. So in any competitive environment, the results, all else being equal, the results are produced by the behaviors. The behaviors, however, stand on a foundation. The foundation starts with the skill and knowledge of the player. Do they understand the behaviors that are necessary? Do they have the requisite knowledge? In sports, that's knowledge of the system that they're running, or it's knowledge of the competition and how they do they run their team, right? In selling, it's often knowledge of competition also, but it's also knowledge of our products and services, our marketplace. So they have the skill and the knowledge necessary to execute the behaviors. And by the way, that depends on the commitment, not just to use those behaviors, although that's a big part of it, but it's also the commitment to continue to improve their skill and knowledge so that they continue to identify and develop differentiation and perform better than their competition. And then ultimately that depends on having the innate talents, which is what we call capacity. That's who they are, right? That's their native intelligence. That may be a sense of urgency, right? So these are the ways in which results are produced. And one thing I want to stress here when we talk about commitment and capacity, it's not just wanting to do well. It's really engaging in the discipline necessary to be better than the competition. And I'll give you just a real quick story on this. I read this sometime back. It was about a quarterbacks coach. And if you follow NFL football, then you know the name Bill Walsh. He was a great coach, quarterbacks coach, offensive coordinator, head coach of the San Francisco 49ers. And he used to run this quarterbacks camp. And when he did, the best quarterbacks in all of football would come to the camp. And I remember they were doing an interview one time, I think it was with Steve Young, former 49ers quarterback, about what they work on. And everybody would think that there's some advanced technique. When you're at the professional level, you're learning some technique nobody else has ever heard of, right? Because you're ready for it. And they were asking him what he worked on, and he just shook his head and said, no, it's nothing advanced. It's the same thing I've been working on since high school: footwork and timing. The mistake that we make sometimes in the sales profession is that we think that everybody has mastered the basics, when in fact, nobody has actually mastered the basics. And the people who do it better than others are the ones that ultimately execute more effectively against the toughest competition, and as a result, win at a higher rate. So this is how results are produced. What I want to talk about next is how coaching affects how salespeople develop, how they leverage their capacity and their commitment to develop the skill and knowledge necessary, and then consistently execute the behaviors that produce the results. So let's talk about what coaches actually do to make this happen on the next slide. I think, there we go. So 4 things that coaches do that help to drive continuous improvement cycles. And I'll say that again, continuous improvement cycles. That is how people get increasingly proficient with skills. That is how they leverage to a greater degree over time knowledge and acquire new knowledge. It is not some one-time event that people go to and all of a sudden they get better. We've done sales training classes for more than 30 years, and they've ranged in length from 2 days to 2 weeks long. And never once in the history of Axiom has somebody left a training class proficient with the skills that we taught. Everyone who ever got good by taking a skill at a time, going through the proven learning cycle that we've learned from neuroscience over the last couple of decades: learn, practice, apply, evaluate. But coaches play an essential role in making this happen, especially across a broader group. If you are running a sales organization and you do a sales training class and you send people to the class and you give them the follow-up material, 2 out of 10 will get good at it. In fact, I'll say this, and we won't see this happen because professional teams know better. But if you ran an NFL team or you ran Premier League soccer club, or you ran one of the baseball teams in Major League Baseball, if you didn't require players to show up for practice, I will submit to you that half of them would not. And what we don't do in sales is we don't have coaches requiring players to show up for practice. So how do coaches do that? 4 things they do. I won't spend a lot of time on this because at the end, we're going to give you a document that outlines this in more detail. But think of it as they're working down the left-hand side of the pyramid. So they're looking for performance and behavior gaps or opportunities. Don't think of gaps as negative. Professionals, the best in their fields, want their coaches to find opportunities for them to improve. So a difference between the result they want to produce and the result they are producing, or the behavior they want to execute and the way they are executing it, that's a gap, but it's an opportunity for improvement. Then what coaches have the expertise to do is identify the root cause of the gap. In other words, is the gap there because they lack skill? Is it there because there's a gap in their knowledge? Is it something to do with their commitment, or is it a capacity issue? Then they define the appropriate corrective action that works up the other side of the pyramid, where they give the person a drill, an activity to do that ultimately improves their skill and knowledge, shrinks the gap, and helps to produce a better behavior. And they're constantly evaluating the cycles, and they do it on a regular cadence. So if we're going to, and this is why this is so important to today's conversation, if we're going to assess the effectiveness of coaching, it absolutely requires that we are measuring both what the sellers do and what the coaches do. If we just measure what coaches do and we don't look at how it's affecting the sellers, then we won't really know whether or not it's being effective. If we just look at what salespeople are doing, then we won't know that coaching is playing the role that it can and should in helping to drive those continuous improvement cycles. So what I want to do next is dive in a little bit deeper for both groups, starting with the sellers. So what should we be measuring when it comes to selling performance and sales behavior in order for us to begin to understand that we're producing the fruits from our coaching efforts that we should? And it starts with results. And I will spend no time on the first bullet because, frankly, if you're on this call, chances are good you already measure results in a variety of different ways, and they're just fine. I will go to the next bullet, though, and say when we talk about results, at the top of the pyramid, results aren't just the sales that we make. They're the combination of predictive metrics that show us how we make them. So that includes things like number of new opportunities. It includes things like closing ratio and average sale value. So we don't just figure out we are making the target number or we are not. We look at how we're making it, because examining those predictive metrics and seeing improvements in those areas can help us to determine whether or not coaching is actually being effective. And again, these are all on the seller side, right? Next is we ought to be measuring adaptability. And I think that Bob's earlier example was great. And, we don't have to have once in a generation global events in order to know whether or not our sales team is becoming more adaptive. In fact, most organizations have change happening multiple times a year. And what we need to do is see the impact the change is having on performance, sales activity. So here's what happens, for example, in many cases. They roll out a new product, and the product launch itself is less than what they anticipated. It takes longer to ramp up. It takes longer for people to learn it. It takes them longer to begin to have meaningful conversations about that product with their prospects and customers. So the question is, can we help the salespeople become more adaptable so that when we launch new products, we go to market more quickly, we achieve our objectives faster than we otherwise would? And there are those kinds of opportunities throughout a given year. Sometimes it's new pricing strategy or new market strategy. Sometimes it's a new competitor. Sometimes it's us focusing on a new opportunity in the marketplace. But there are changes happening. As Bob said, people were predicting that there would be more change even before COVID. And that's going to prove to continue to be true as we go forward. So how quickly can our people adapt to change depends on how good they are at one thing, and that is learning. And so if we want them to be more adaptable, they need to get good at learning, at acquiring new information, and applying that to their environment, using skills and improving their skills in order to adapt to the new situation that they face. And coaching will drive that if the coaching is done right. So we'll get to that in a minute. The other thing we want to be able to measure is we want to be able to measure selling behaviors. And this example comes to mind. I actually saw this in an NFL game this year. There was a wide receiver going out for a pass, and the wide receiver was wide open. So that means that the person covering him, in this case, the cornerback, did not do the job the cornerback was supposed to do for whatever reason, right? However, the wide receiver fell down. The pass was thrown to the wide open wide receiver and went into the hands of the out of position cornerback. In terms of the results, the cornerback got an interception. However, I can promise you that when they watched game film, the reward the cornerback got with all of the applause and the adulations on the sidelines in the game, that is not what they got in the game film, because the cornerback failed to execute. So one of the things we've got to get good at if we're going to assess coaching effectiveness is we have to measure the execution of our players. And we measure the execution by observing them in the field. So one thing that managers need to do if they're going to become good coaches is don't take over every call they're on, but observe the calls and actually pay attention. And we have to have a model, by the way, for what the ideal behaviors look like. If we have no model for what people are supposed to do when they're qualifying, the questions they're supposed to ask, the way in which they're supposed to present our solutions, there's nothing to compare it to. So we need to be able to measure that, which means we have to have competency models for that. And we have to do it both in the field, and we have to get in the habit of practicing it. So in the NFL, for example, player behavior, their execution is scored every single play through practice and the game. And those scores are reviewed to see, are they improving? And where there are gaps in those behaviors, it's the coach's job to figure out, is it a skill gap, a knowledge gap, a capacity or commitment gap? And we do that by role playing with them and asking them questions. What were you thinking? What did you see? Let's go through it together and role play it together. So that's how we evaluate that. And then the last one, capacity and commitment are really important. So first off, I'll put this out there, and we can always, again, this is covered in a little bit more detail in the guide. You must hire capacity to do the job. We cannot give people native intelligence. We cannot necessarily, at least in most cases, provide them with integrity, right? So we have to hire capacity. And the only way to know that somebody lacks the capacity to do the job is to coach them. In other words, identify a performance gap, determine the root cause in terms of skill and knowledge, give them an assignment to do, and maybe a couple. And even though they do the assignments, they don't get any better. It may be they don't have the capacity to get any better. But we don't know that someone lacks the capacity just because they're failing to produce a result. And so anytime in your organizations you hear a manager say, yeah, Bob's not making his number, and I think he just doesn't have the capacity for the job, the question you want to ask is, well, what coaching did you do? What root causes for the performance gap did you identify? What assignments did you give them to address the root cause? And what happened when you gave them an assignment? Because it's too easy in many sales organizations to say, oh, it's the person, and then go hire the person, a new person. And unfortunately, what we end up doing in many cases is giving the same ineffective coach a new body to ruin again. And we don't want to do that, right? And then commitment, again, it's really easy to identify a commitment problem. If I went to the trouble of identifying an opportunity to improve as a coach, and I gave somebody an assignment and they don't do it, that's a commitment problem. The other thing we run into in sales is we tolerate commitment problems to a greater extent than we should. If people say, I want to make X amount of money and I want to produce a great result, and I'm committed to doing the work necessary, but they won't invest 30 minutes of their time to getting better each week, or an hour of their time to getting better each week, then they don't really have the commitment necessary to succeed at a higher level than the competition. And then I really love this last one, and I'm going to ask Bob to come back on and talk about this. How do we really measure employee satisfaction? Because the typical company-wide surveys, they don't necessarily give us what we need to know to evaluate coaching effectiveness.
Yeah, I agree here. I think this is a area that might take a bit of a shift in mindset around what we're doing with coaching. I mean, I think it's like a lot of programs that we roll out to the sales organization. CRM, for example, or the incentive comp plan. They're seen as things we do to salespeople, not necessarily things we do with salespeople. Well, coaching is one of these things that you're not going to do it to your coachee, you're going to do it with them. So I think we have to have that mindset. And remember also that coaching is considered a thing that enhances the workplace for high performing sales organizations, and certainly for for high performing salespeople, and certainly also for new salespeople. Good salespeople in general, the salespeople you want, see coaching and development when it's really good as something beneficial to their employment experience. Um, the question remains: can we measure their satisfaction? The answer is yes. Of course, it is yes. In fact, oops, did I go there we go. So we merely need to ask. I knew I went too far. There we go. Nice. Let me make this larger. So we do need to ask, but I would point out a couple of things. Again, first of all, we know it's especially important for the most important salespeople and also our new salespeople. You probably want to measure satisfaction, or at least sentiment, and get input from those two populations separately and monitor them separately. The second thing I'd point out is let's adopt a customer supplier mindset. In other words, think about your people being coached as a customer. You just like you would, any marketer, you'd want to do market research. You'd want to have customer sat data. You want also to sort of take it from their perspective. Think about the most cynical person in the sales organization who is getting coached. They might say something like, I hate this place, but at least I'm becoming better at this job and I'm therefore more valuable. Ask them if that's true. Ask them, are we helping you build your inventory of marketable skills in this position? If they can answer that question, yes, then you know that the coaching is received in a manner that it's perceived as valuable and effective, and that's very important. Salespeople want to be autonomous. At least they want to have some degree of autonomy. And also, we know that coaching doesn't work if you jam it down the gullets of your salespeople. What you want is a measure of collaboration, some degree of self-determination. You want to, among people getting coached, you want to make sure that the things you're working on with coaching are generally aligned with the things that people getting coached feel like they should be working on. And these are important things, I think, to measure separately. And then just a general comment, you want to, ask frequently, what can we do better in the coaching program that we have? What's working, what's not working? I think when coaching is done well, it becomes indistinguishable from culture, and so these are the kind of questions people ask in a culture that's really focused on developing people. So, yeah, we need to ask this question: what do our people getting coached feel, and what do they think about the coaching effort?
Yeah, great points, Bob. And that last one is so essential. And I will say that over 30 years, I've never seen a sales rep at any level, by the way, high performer, underperformer, who didn't give high marks to coaching that was actually focused on helping them get better. And that really gets to what and how we should measure the coaching effectiveness. So we've talked now about what are we measuring for the reps and how do we measure those things? And the assumption, right, the premise is that good coaching will drive better results in those metrics we just covered. However, it isn't just good coaching that could drive those results. So if those results get better and managers aren't there at all, it wasn't coaching that drove those results. It is possible for individual sellers to improve in those areas on their own. It's without coaching, like we talked about with professional athletes even, Or performing arts, by the way, one of my good friends is a viola player for the Dallas Symphony Orchestra. He has to practice. He might not. He'd rather ride his bike. He might not practice and eat cookies, by the way. So he might ride his bike and eat cookies, were it not for the fact that there's an expectation to it. So how does coaching actually drive that? So on the next slide, we're going to talk about some of the things that we want to measure that managers do. And I'm going to start with, and I didn't
say, Bob.
Yes.
Forgive me for interrupting. I thought
No.
it might be a good time to simply ask if there are questions or comments. I'm going to put up our little banner here. You may add those to the chat window. You can click on that on the right, top right of your screen, or you can email them to us. You do that by using the address shown in that scrolling banner, support@salesmanagement.org. And we'll keep an eye on those.
Excellent.
Look forward to discussing those shortly.
And I did not put on the next slide what we shouldn't be measuring, because I was afraid if we put it on the slide, somebody might later confuse it with what we should measure. So here's what we shouldn't measure. It's not on here. We shouldn't measure meetings between salespeople and managers. And by the way, that doesn't mean that those aren't useful. We shouldn't measure them because oftentimes there is a conversation, maybe there's a lunch, maybe there's a joint sales call, but there isn't coaching. That doesn't mean there isn't feedback. And here's the way we distinguish between the two. If as a manager, I point out that you did something well or did it poorly, you produced a good result or you produced a negative result, that's not coaching, that's feedback. And by the way, it's nothing wrong with it. It's not a bad thing. It's not bad. It's just not sufficient to help people get better. It transforms into coaching if, in addition to identifying the opportunity to improve, I figure out why there is a gap and I give you an activity to do that's going to help you shrink that gap. Then it becomes coaching. So don't just measure the fact that they met with reps or they went on calls with reps. Measure whether or not they did the analysis that's necessary and gave out the assignment. So we do want to measure coaching interactions. And by the way, it's okay to measure the feedback sessions too, and all interactions, but we want to see what percentage of those actually have assignments associated with them. So it's coaching interactions, both the frequency of those, the distribution of those. By the way, great coaches don't just coach the bottom performers. They don't just coach the top performers. They coach everybody. And they do it in part by leveraging what they learn from the best performers that can help them apply and help lower performers, middle performers develop new skills. So they don't just coach one group or another. So we're looking for frequency. We're looking for fairly even distribution. And we're looking for the type of coaching interaction. So are they doing opportunity reviews? Are they doing joint calls? And we're wanting to know whether or not there were assignments given, and are they evaluating performance against some standards? So what we have to do as an organization in order to enable them is a couple of things. Number one is we have to have a model for the ideal selling behaviors. Much like a sports team might have a playbook, they have a philosophy for how they approach the game. They have plays that they run. They have a language that they use, and they are measuring each player against their role in a particular play. We've got to be able to measure the degree to which people not are just producing the result we want, but are executing on the behaviors that we want. And so we need to equip managers with a competency model that's easy for them to use to evaluate people when they observe calls or when they do role plays with people. And by the way, if you're not role playing every single week, if every rep isn't engaged in some practice activity every single week, there's a great opportunity to drive significantly better performance. And in most sales organizations, that doesn't happen. And it really is one of those, if you've read James Cramer's books, it's one of those atomic habits. Learning, practice, and coaching are atomic habits for a sales organization that drive dramatically better results. On the assignment side, we really need to equip the managers with a library of assignments. So if you're a PGA teaching professional, you've got a PGA resource library that has tons and tons of suggested assignments, drills, and activities that you can give to your students based on whatever the swing flaw is that you find. We need to have that available for managers. And we also need an easy way for them to be able to track their engagements and even help them diagnose the root cause. But if we're measuring these things and we're measuring those seller characteristics, now we have the data that we need in order to evaluate coaching effectiveness. There are a couple of subtle little points to make here that bring it together so that we can really determine how effective we are. And so on the next slide, just a couple of measurement principles that I want to cover with you that will help make sure that we're doing this well. So first off, we can't just look at absolute numbers in a vacuum. So every number we look at needs to be relative to a target, which means, and we talked about this in our last session, if you're implementing a coaching program, it's important to define coaching standards. How frequently should coaching conversations happen? What should they look like? What type should they be? And then measure it against those targets and share it openly with people. Let them see how they're doing against the target. Also, see how it's doing over time. I would be much more enthusiastic and less concerned about somebody who is missing a target, but the trend is moving up, than somebody who hit the target once, but the trend is moving down. So we want to see how's it moving over time. And then we want to correlate these activities with the desired outcome. So I want to actually see what have the coaching interactions been like for salespeople whose performance is improving, whose skill is being measured as demonstrably better, and what is it like where it's not happening? And where there is something that's unexpected, what we've got to do is dive in. Just looking at the metrics doesn't tell me what happened. And so what we don't want is we don't want to react to the metrics other than to use gaps as an opportunity to go explore more deeply to figure out what the root cause is. And then this last one, I really can't emphasize this enough. I think you can make an argument as one of the biggest reasons why coaching initiatives don't succeed is we don't reward the behaviors we want. If the organization today, before you implemented the coaching program, let's say, was hyper-focused on measuring outcomes, sales results, you implement the coaching program and we still measure the same outcomes and we haven't added to those the selling and coaching metrics that help us understand how the outcomes are being produced, and we just reward people for producing the outcomes, the programs are going to fail because people aren't going to be incentivized to engage in the behaviors necessary and the learning curve necessary to get good at it. So correlating coaching measures to seller measures helps us ultimately determine the effectiveness of the program, and then celebrating those successes and making those something that making that something that other people want is really essential to coaching becoming a habit. And Bob and I talked about this as we were preparing for today. One of the things that's interesting to me about coaching programs is oftentimes companies that implement a coaching program, they don't implement it and then it fails spectacularly. They implement it and then they don't measure and they don't share, and there's not enough transparency and there's not enough root cause analysis. And so ultimately it just loses enthusiasm. They stop holding people accountable for doing it. People get distracted by other things. The company decides not to continue to invest in it because they can't see the tangible results tied to the coaching and selling behaviors. So if we want our programs to be successful, it's really important that we spend a significant amount of our energy understanding what and how we're going to measure these things and establishing targets. And don't worry if you get the targets wrong initially. It's not essential that the target be right. It's essential that we understand how it's moving over time and that we set targets that are ever more objective and accurate going forward. I'll take a breath there. Bob, do we have questions? Anything you want to add? I probably missed something.
Well, we do have a few questions. Again, if you have a question or comment, feel free to chime in. We've got a chat window in the upper right corner of the screen, and also you can email us at support@salesmanagement.org. Let's get to some of the questions now, if you're in a question answering mood. Bob Sanders.
I am always in a question answering mood.
I see. Okay, so let's see. Who should do the coaching is a
great question.
Question to ask.
Yeah.
are we talking about just the manager here or other people?
Great question. So in an organization, we didn't hit on the next level up, by the way, which is a whole nother way that this should be done. So in an ideal scenario, managers should be primarily responsible. However, you may have super coaches and you may have coaches who coach the coach. And in some organizations, by the way, as they're trying to drive the adoption of their behavior early on, and if they haven't been able to do some of the things that we talked about in the last session, like create space for the sales managers, they will actually create a specific coaching organization. However, I think that for most organizations, it is the sales manager that you want to do this. And the reason for that is a couple of things. Number one is they have the most leverage with the people on their team. So if you report to me and I give you an assignment to do and you don't do it, it's going to be a little bit different dynamic than if somebody in a professional development organization who's helping us gives us assignments we don't do. So it's better leverage if the managers can do it. However, I will say that enabling them to do it well really requires, in most cases, making an investment in some content and tools because they're not able to dedicate the time necessary to become so proficient with the methodology that they can do it all on their own without help.
And they are not expert coaches by default because they are sales managers. Yeah.
Right. Which is why the next level coaching the coaches, somebody needs to observe them having coaching conversations and help them get better.
Related question. Let's tee this one up. Here we go. Can coaching be successful if the coaches aren't getting coached themselves?
Well, I'll answer it this way. Sellers can be successful if they don't get coaches, and they can be successful adopting a sales methodology, but only at a rate of about 20% of the people. And the same applies to managers. If coaches aren't being coached, and if there isn't really good mechanism for helping them get better, and if they're not being held accountable to those behaviors, then 2 out of 10 of them will get good and the rest will not. In fact, one of the folks that's a partner with us in Axiom, Tony Lanham, was with Exo Communications, eventually was acquired by Verizon. And he was one of 2 managers in the country that became really effective at coaching. There were about 15 that didn't. And the difference in the results where the managers coach was significant. And that's what will happen. You'll get 2 out of 10 or so who can do it unless you start coaching the coaches. Great question. Really important point.
Yeah, I think it's a great question too. I worry about the signal it sends. It sends the signal coaching for thee, but not for me. You know,
absolutely.
Does it mean that coaching is, not really something we believe in? It's just something I'm tormenting you with.
Right.
Because I'm able to. Okay, let's get to some more questions. Let's see. A question maybe about tools here. What SaaS tools do you use to implement these
Well, this is
processes?
Awkward.
Let us first acknowledge, is a SaaS tool required to implement these processes? Yes.
It is not required in order to implement the processes.
Yeah.
You can implement them with spreadsheets and paper. And so here's what I will say. So first off, we are a provider. We provide sales training and a SaaS, sales performance and coaching tool. So full disclosure, we provide that. Here's what is absolutely required. There needs to be a library of content. So not a sales training class in hour-long modules, but micro-learning elements that support every skill and every behavior that's a part of your sales methodology. So you have to have that content one way or another. It could be paper, but it really needs to be interactive and engaging if people are going to use it. So that has to be there, right? It's better if you also have product information, market information, things that you want to do to expand knowledge in that same kind of format. And when I say micro-learning, I mean anything longer than about 15 minutes is way too long. You really want it to be discrete skills that people can go get refreshed on very quickly and get reinforced on. So that has to be there. There has to be something that you give managers that helps them make a connection between a skill gap and the appropriate assignment. It could be low tech, a matrix that says, if you see this skill, then here are the assignments that are available. It could be higher tech SaaS tool like what we provide. And then the last thing is, and you alluded to this before, Bob, sales managers are not just naturally gifted coaches. The diagnosing of a performance gap isn't as easy as you might think. If you can give them something to help them do that quickly and effectively, that's really useful. And then if you wrap that in technology, what happens is the difference between doing it in technology and doing a low-tech version is in technology, you see who's using it and who isn't, and what kinds of things they're experiencing and what challenges they're facing. And that gives you more information that you can use to intervene more intelligently.
Great question. Thank you, David. Let's see what else we can find in our question bin. Here's a good question. Who should decide on the coaching agenda?
What are the options? what are my choices?
Okay, I'll embellish on behalf of our questioner. You can have them be entirely determined by the person being coached. Here's what I want to work on. You could have them entirely developed by management. You could have some collaborative approach where you jointly agree on coaching improvement priorities,
right,
with a conscious intent to try to incorporate what the coachee thinks is important, if possible. I don't know. So I think it's important to have some input. And
yes, I would agree. It really is a collaborative engagement when it works best. So first off, when you're beginning a coaching program, so if I were walking into a team that hadn't been coached in this way before and had only been given feedback, once we establish what the standards are, what the ideal behaviors are, what the artifacts of those are, I would probably let the rep pick early on, hey, what do you want to work on first? If we identify 5 opportunities for improvement, I'm less concerned with picking the one that has the greatest impact than I am concerned with the rep experiencing the cycles of identifying an opportunity, figuring out the root cause, getting an activity that shrinks the gap and helps them get better. That cycle, and them being committed to doing their part, just getting through the cycle, them being committed and getting that reward is the most important thing. It's not so important that we pick the right one anyway. So if they're committed to one more so than they are the other, I don't care, because we're at the beginning. We want to develop a habit of coaching and learning together. Later on, there may be times when, as their coach, I need to assert my expertise because they are heading down a path that is less optimum for them, but I need enough credibility. I need to have demonstrated my ability as the coach to help them to get better, preferably before I start doing that.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, and wouldn't the answer be different for different types of salespeople? A new salesperson might be looking for a lot of guidance. Where do I start? An experienced, really good salesperson, it's probably really important to have them drive much of the agenda.
You'd think, but if anybody on the call has coached any Gen Z salespeople, and I hate to use a category, but if you've coached some new people actually think they already know everything.
Okay, Boomer.
Some more mature, more experienced reps are more open to the coaching. The other thing I want to address here is the agenda itself. That should be structured by the coach, and the agenda, the flow that we go through should be very consistent. The coach needs to have the agenda. The what topic we're going to apply the agenda to can be collaborative.
Okay, these are good points. Thank you. I'm sorry I called you a boomer. One cranky old guy to another.
I'm sorry that you called me that in front of, I don't know how 100 people, however many people are here.
It's a demographic objective.
It's just a demographic. It's not a label.
Right, exactly. So maybe one more question. Let's see. Here's one. I've seen this question before on this topic. How do we make sure sales managers spend enough time coaching? Maybe put a different way. Our managers don't have time to coach. We get that in some of our research responses. This is why we don't coach. There's no time.
Right, right. So first thing I would suggest is I would start, if it was me, by figuring out how much time managers are actually spending with each of the reps. And I would ask them to just give me and track it. Don't guess. Track how much time you spend, because that'll be enlightening. What we typically find, though, isn't that managers don't spend enough time with the reps. It's that there isn't enough structure, and they don't have enough skill, and they don't have the right objectives to make that time valuable from a coaching perspective. So the way you do it is, one, track the amount of time, but also track what's happening in that time. Most of the clients that we've worked with don't need to spend more time with their people. And they don't need to do things they don't already do. They already go on joint calls. They already debrief the call afterward. They just don't have quite the right conversation to make it coaching. They already talk about opportunities all the time. They just don't do it in a way that enables it to evolve from feedback into coaching. And so they're relatively small, but really important changes that have to be made. So I would say track the time. If they're really not spending enough of it, then you're going to have to figure out why they're not spending enough. Are we creating, as an organization, other demands? They're competing for their time. Like, is forecasting taking too long? Are we giving them too many customer support issues to resolve themselves? Are they addicted to throwing themselves in the middle and doing things for the reps that they shouldn't do? We have to figure out the root cause and then create some standard about how much time you think it should take. A coaching conversation can be done in its entirety in 1 hour per rep per week easily. So most managers spending that much time with the rep.
That's very good guidance. Thank you. Let's do a couple of things, just a few minutes left. So the first thing is, let's circle back to that slide that I sort of bungled earlier. I'm hoping this is it.
Nope.
It's not.
It's the last one. It's slide number, roughly, 23.
Okay, well, let me look for that one then. Maybe it is this one.
It is that one. So
Excellent.
This QR code, do you want me to describe this, or you want to describe it?
Please, you go ahead.
So This QR code, we talked a little bit in the call, and we have in the past, on the difference between coaching and feedback. And here we focused on assessing your coaching program. So this is the Guide to Sales Coaching. It's essentially a white paper. It's a short read, and it outlines how to use goal setting so that you get on the same page and earn the right to coach by really embracing the goals of the seller, how to uncover gaps, identify the root cause, define corrective action, then evaluate performance. So it goes through what the guide model is. But at the bottom, at the back half of this, back end, is an assessment that you can use to begin to evaluate the effectiveness of your current coaching program. It's just 10 quick questions. And then there's some guidelines on what good next steps might be depending on what your score range is. And then there's also a detailed outline for that roughly hour-long one-on-one meeting that I just described, and how you use Guide in that meeting to change the conversation about metrics or pipeline or funnel, and conversation about an opportunity to transform it from feedback into coaching. So that's all in that one guide, and you just scan the code and we'll send you the link, and it'll get to you automatically.
Terrific. Thank you. These will be included in the slides available for download as well. That QR code. Thank you for making that available, Bob. We hope our audience will avail themselves of it. Let's do one other thing. Let's talk about the next session in this series, which is ultimately a 5-part series. The next will be on course correcting sales coaching programs. How do you fix something that jumps the tracks? You can join us for that session on December 12th. You can also learn about many other sessions we have available while you're here on the site at salesmanagement.org. You want to go to the events tab and learn about other sessions. Bob, sadly, we're out of time. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Enjoyed it, as always.
Terrific insights. So I will, since we're at the top of the hour, I'll leave it here. Thank you once again to Bob Sanders from Axiom Sales Kinetics. And to our audience, thank you so much for your time and attention today. Good luck with your own coaching programs, and we'll see you next time. Take care.